Hi, my name is Dennis and welcome to my second video on data quality testing with Soda Core on Databricks. In the last video, we discussed how to check a New York yellow taxi dataset and more specifically the passenger count using the open source data quality testing framework called Soda Core. We created a notebook that essentially told us that two checks were failing. And in this notebook, in this video, we want to go one step further and we want to save all the failed rows of this test. The reason why we may want to do this is that imagine if you have the test running more often, you could, for example, use this data to diagnose your issues more specifically. So what we want to have at the end of this video is a workflow that will automatically save the failed rows of the tests in a Databricks Delta table because we are already on Databricks. And the way to do this, following the Soda Core documentation, is to leverage the failed row samples feature. More specifically, the failed rows sample feature is implemented for Python using a custom sampler. So let's have a look at this. And at its core, the custom sampler is a class that is defined here, and it will basically implement a store sample method. And the idea is that it's up to the user, so it's up to us to define the store sample method to do what we want. Now, if you want to have more details about how this code is implemented, I would recommend you to go to the Soda Core GitHub repository, where you will find here how the sampler works and why you have to implement your own store sample method. I will post a link into the video. Now, what we can do is essentially copy paste this code and then modify it so that it not only prints the rows in a console, but actually writes them to a Databricks Delta table. Now, to save time in this video, I have actually already copy pasted this code here into my custom sampler Databricks notebook, and I have already implemented the store sample method to write a Spark data frame to a Delta table. Let's quickly go over the code. So in my custom sampler, I pass the Delta table name as an argument. And then I implemented the store sample function as follows. In essence, I will still get the rows and obtain the schema from the sample. But then, given that the rows will be returned as a list, I need to convert that list into a PySpark data frame so that we can write it to a Delta table. This is essentially what this code below here does. It obtains the struct fields from the schema, then creates the data frame schema, and then creates a data frame from the rows and the schema. Now, I won't go too deep in the implementation, but I had to define an additional helper function that maps the name of the types in Soda Core output to an actual type in PySpark imported here. At the end of the day, what will happen is that the failed rows will be written to our Delta table with this given name, and we will receive a console message stating how many rows have been added to this Delta table. So let's now look how to implement this custom sampler in our existing yellow taxi notebook that we created the previous time. What we will have to do is we will have to actually execute this notebook so that we can have access to this class. So I will run the MyCustomSampler notebook. Let's first rerun these blocks. All right, so that seems to be working. The next thing that we will have to do is we have to Um, Again, we're gonna read the table, we're gonna create the temporary view, as in the first video. And then when we create the scan in the documentation, we see that the way this works is that we initialize a sampler as an attribute in our scan object. So I'm going to do something similar in my code. I will say that I have in my scan instance, I have a sampler, and this sampler is equal to my custom sampler. Now, my custom sampler, remember, expects the delta table name for the failed rows as an argument. So let's see where we can create this table in the catalog. If I go to the catalog and then look in my workspace, in my yellow taxi volume, I have currently one table. And what I will do, I will just basically copy the path to this table, but then slightly modify its name to create a second table under the same volume. So returning to my workspace and to my notebook, I can now go back to where I'm creating the sampler and then paste the name of the table, and I will change the name slightly by adding failed rows. So in this table, namely yellow trip data January 2024 failed rows, this is a table where the failed rows will eventually land. So I can execute this code now. Again, we're going to add the soda checks YAML file. And now I essentially expect that I will receive a print message here when I execute this code, in addition to the previous result messages that we got. And indeed, we see that we wrote 100 rows, which is the default maximum number of sampled rows added to a table. And we see that it has been added to this table here. Now, why do we see this line twice? We see it twice because we see it for every one of the two checks that failed. Let's inspect this table in the catalog. If I go to the catalog, again to my workspace and then to my yellow taxi volume, I see that now I have a second table where I have the rows that failed. And essentially, if you recall the test we defined in our previous video, the rows that failed were essentially those where the passenger count was smaller than 1 or larger than 6. So here we see that for these failed rows, the passenger count is 0. Now, in practice, you would probably improve this by adding some more information about the test in this failed rows table, but I wanted to at least demonstrate this feature now. If you want, you can actually increase the number of failed rows that are returned. So currently this is bound by only 100. So let's look at the documentation of how to do that. So there's failed row samples, and if I'm not mistaken, customize sampling, set a sample limit. We can actually just simply add the sample limit to our test under the checks definition itself. So let's increase the number of failed rows returned for the first check. So if I go here again in my yellow taxi notebook to my checks YAML file, I see here I have for this check as follows, and I think I have to add the sample limit here. Yeah, let's give that a try. And re-execute the notebook. And hopefully in this case, I will see that the maximum number of failed rows is not 100 for the first check, but 50. So the run completed, and indeed we see that now the first check only stores 50 rows to the delta table, whereas the second stores the default amount of 100 rows to the delta table. Alright, this is all I wanted to show for this video. We can not just output the result in a console, but we can actually store the failed rows in anything you want, really. In this video, I stored the results in a Databricks delta table, but you can also store it in a file in a CSV, because at the end of the day, what you do with the failed rows is defined in the store sample method you define yourself. As always, I will add the relevant resources below in the description, and I will see you in the next video.